Chicago, and I wanted to get together with these people, and I had some pictures they may want to see. And so I stayed at my sister's house. Well, she wasn't there. She just loaned me her house, loaned me her car. And so while I'm sitting there, I'm looking around for reading material, and I ran across this. This book says Hidden Images, Discovering Details in the Wright Brothers Kitty Hawk Photographs, 1900 to 1911. What I never knew, and probably most of you maybe didn't either, is these Wright brothers were picture takers. At some point they shelled out $55 for a camera, and the film was getting easier to use. They developed their own, and they began taking pictures of things. And I thought, gee, that's interesting. And then this year, if you're really interested in the Wright brothers, I strongly recommend this book by David McCulloch. This guy is a great writer. The storytelling ability, he's a scholar too, but the storytelling ability is just like you're there, and it's called The Wright Brothers. So that's what kind of got me thinking. Have you ever wondered what it's like to be someplace where some event is happening that is just world-changing? And I got to thinking, maybe with those pictures, and then I got the McCulloch book, and he had some excellent pictures. All of that said, you know, maybe we can begin to make you feel like you're there with the Wright brothers. Well, who are these guys? There's a picture. I don't know what you think they look like. A couple of ministers maybe, or something like that? No, they weren't. It's Orville on the right and Wilbur on the left. And I think there's really no question that these guys were the first to design an airplane with a motor that could carry humans through the air. And look how much that's changed. In fact, at some point, they founded a bicycle manufacturing company. More than that, they did repairs, they sold bicycles, but they made them. And I got to thinking, what is there about these two guys who look so gloomy here? What is there about them that made them the ones that found a way to build a plane that can go through the air carrying humans? Let me tell you something about them. Orville, you can see, Wilbur is the older one, in 1867. You can also see he died rather young, 1912. And the reason he died was he had typhoid. And back in those days, that could be fatal very easily. And so he did. But all of the work, much of the work before 1912, he was able to do. And both of these guys are extremely hard workers. Now think about this. If you're going to do something to change the world, you need time, right? Well, neither one married. I don't even think they dated anybody. They just worked. Everything that was always working or reading or thinking but something else. These two guys were so often arguing. You know, science is a funny thing. Somebody does an experiment, they publish it, it gets attention, and then they start yak, arguing and arguing. You didn't do it right, you didn't control for it, and so forth. These guys, whatever it is they were thinking about, they'd start to argue. And it would sound like they hated each other, but they didn't. They ate their meals together. I think they even slept in the same bedroom. They had the same bank account. They did everything together. And people who knew them said, you know, they don't talk much to other people, but boy, to each other they really do talk. Well, here they are. Look at Orville's dates. He died in 1948. So here's the guy, one of the two, who invented the airplane invented the control mechanisms for the airplane. So when you get out there, if you can't control it, you're dead. Forget it. They worked it out. These people made at least 1,000 flights, and never once were they seriously injured. You've got to see why that's important. But Orville lived long enough. I read this somewhere that at some point he was up in an airliner, I think it was probably a small DC-3, and the pilot let him fly it for a while. So he was able to go from one of those things to flying a small airliner. That was one thing. He lived through World War II. Now here's a guy who helped invent the airplane. And he read about how many people were killed by airplanes, dropping bombs, shooting machine guns, and all of that. And of course, I think that may have affected him a little bit. He saw jet propulsion come, he saw rockets come, and so he lived long enough to see all of this happening. Well, here's the rest of the family. Actually, there are two brothers who don't really count. They're older, the older brothers, and they didn't really get very much into airplanes, so they're not part of our story. Here's the father, Bishop Milton Wright. Worked his way up to become a bishop in his church. He traveled, he preached, he dealt with all kinds of issues that bishops deal with. And I think more than that, he had around the house reading material, and he encouraged his family to read, keep up with things. So this guy had an advanced degree, probably seminary trained and so forth. Here's the sister, Catherine, Oberlin College, honors student, graduated somewhere around 1900, and lovely person. She and the two brothers very close, and she just really gave them a lot of attention and a lot of time, and they all got along pretty well. Well, where did all these great things happen? Well, there's the house on Hawthorne Street. Let me get my marker, so we don't set off that speaker. This is the house that they lived in for many, many years. This is the house that was in Dayton, Ohio. And this is the building that contained, if you can't read that maybe, it says Wright Cycle Company. That building doesn't look very big, but that's where they made the bicycles, stored the bicycles, sold the bicycles, and they sold about 150 a year without a lot of help. These guys. And what's really amazing is the right side of that building was the undertaker. Now, just by chance. The embalmer, the undertaker, and so he used up a part of the building. And these guys had a pretty narrow building, but it looks like there's kind of an add-on in the back there. These buildings now are not in Dayton. And if you can read it, it says Hawthorne Street, Greenfield Village, Dearborn, Michigan. How many have been to Greenfield Village in Dearborn, Michigan? Dick? Oh, you should go there. Henry Ford, when he began to get into the big bucks, Henry Ford once said, I don't know why he said it, but he once said, history is bunk. That's what he said. But when he got the money, he began to invest in history, and the Henry Ford Museum is an incredible thing to see. Go there, it's just incredible. But he also collected buildings. This is the Wright brothers' home. This is the cycle shop. He collected them, they took them apart, they moved them, they rebuilt them here, and so you can actually go there and see them. It is really a remarkable thing. I strongly recommend it. Yeah. Well, I don't know how this happened, but around 1899, Wilbur, the older brother, who was often the kind of the bully, the guy who started the arguments, he'd make the most noise and all of that, kind of pushed Orville around a little bit. He became interested in flying. And I haven't been able to tell why. I don't think they were thinking money at first. It was sort of like this idea kind of caught them and they couldn't let go. So they began to say, well, okay, let's find out who's flying in any way possible, and we'll write to them and we'll read their papers and read their books if they're books. Well, they knew people had been flying in balloons. I don't know if you noticed recently, well, there was some woman who was flying in a balloon and landed on a main street somewhere and got out and said, boy, these things are really hard to steer. They knew that too, of course. And so they didn't, balloons have been around since about the American Revolutionary War, 18th century. But in terms of anything useful like transportation, yeah, we make a big deal in Janesville, as you know, but that's fun and all that, but it's not a great way to travel because you have no control over where you're going. But if you're going to fly, and they knew they need propulsion, and think about this, in 1899, what do you use for propulsion? Some people actually tried to build a flying machine with a steam engine. If you can believe that. Gasoline engines were coming along. A few cars were around, but the engines weren't very good. Henry Ford, getting back to him, he worked for Thomas Edison when Edison was in the electricity business. And he worked for Edison. Edison liked him. He found him very clever and very hardworking. And in Ford's spare time, behind his house in the garage, he was building a car. In about 1895, one early morning, he drove this thing around the neighborhood. Probably aroused a lot of people. 1895, he had an engine that worked. Well, before you get to the engine now, before you get to propulsion, what you need to know is control. And so a lot of these people, including the Wright brothers, would spend a lot of time watching birds and say, wow, how do they do that? Birds make it look so easy. Man, look at that. Hummingbird comes by. Stays perfectly still, sucking things out of the flower. How do they do that? Well, here's a guy who watched the birds too, Lilienthal, Otto Lilienthal, a German glider pilot. If you look at his glider here, don't those wings look a little bit like bird wings? As it turns out, the wing shape, the so-called airfoil, is really very, very important. And the reason is, when the air goes by that wing, on top and on bottom, they're shaped a little differently. And because they are, it goes across the top wing a little faster, it creates a little bit of a vacuum, and that tends to raise the wing and you get some lift. So the shape of those wings is really critical. But look at this. Well, you know what it's like. You take off in an airplane, right? You're sitting in the airplane. And what do? Well, the airplane goes down the runway. The runway. And you can imagine this guy taking off, going down the runway, and his feet are hanging out. Now, when I look at these pictures, even with the magnifying glass, there are a number of pictures like this, I cannot tell what is holding these guys in there. I don't see any belts, I don't see anything to sit on, but there he is, Lilienthal, starting in 1869, flying gliders. But look at the bad news. 1896, flying. He got pretty high, I think it was about 50 feet, 60 feet, and then lost control, went down, and he broke his spine, and that was the end of him. He died. So the Wright brothers really couldn't write to him anymore. Although Yogi Berra, by the way, there was something I read yesterday about Yogi Berra. He said, it's very important that you go to the funeral of people, because if you don't go to theirs, They won't come to yours. Well, anyway, the point here being that every time those guys went up in the air, they were putting their lives on the line. And they did it over 1,000 times. Well, here's another guy, Samuel Pierpont Langley. Now this guy was pretty well known. He was in physics, he was in astronomy, he had a reputation as being a good scientist, and they made him secretary of the Smithsonian. Now when you see secretary like that, it doesn't mean he's, writing letters out for people. It means he's the boss. He's the big guy. There was I think it was English, a guy named Smithson, who for some reason, many, many years ago, gave a lot of money to the U.S. government. And he said, make some kind of a bureau to collect scientific information, to display scientific things, and all of that. Well, that's what it is, and now, of course, the Smithsonian has, I think, at least 7 different museums. At any rate, this guy was able to get, in government money, $50,000. And then he collected some more from friends. He got $70,000. Look at the bottom line. From 1903, according to one study, to 1942, people claimed that this guy invented the airplane that carried people using an engine, not the Wright brothers. I'm going to let you decide that for yourself. We'll show you that later on. But at any rate, he was very secretive. So they're trying to get information out of him. I don't think they succeeded very well. By the way, this is what Langley did. Here's where his 70 grand went. First, he's got this big houseboat. Then he's got a platform here. Then he's got a catapult. And then he's got a couple of planes there, which have this angle called dihedral. And that's there. Well, you got to wonder about some things. Would you agree to fly for Langley? Langley himself never flew. But he got a guy to do it for him. And the guy's name was Charles Manley. I think he was Manley. I think he was also crazy. But he agreed to fly. Now, there's no wheels. This is on the Potomac River. And so if you do fly down the river, the only chance you have is you got to, of course, land in the water. You've got to do that. And then hopefully get out safely. Did this happen? Well, we'll talk about it later. But anyhow, this is the way Langley's experimentation went in 1903. Now, the date you need to remember is December 17th, 1903. December 17th, 1903. That's the day the Wright brothers flew a powered airplane successfully. That's the big deal, successfully. Well, this guy was flying. It was kind of a hobby, though. He wasn't too serious. He himself didn't fly. His name is Chinook, but he became a good friend of the Wright brothers. And he was helpful to them, and he helped give them information, and he helped to criticize ideas and so forth. So he really was very, he made bridges, he was an engineer, he made bridges, he made big buildings, he did all kinds of engineering stuff. So a really, really bright guy in his own way. But what these bicycles look like, I think I can tell you it's not like the bicycles you're thinking about. They look something like this. But now this is about 1900. If you were looking at a bicycle 10 or 20 years before that, you might have seen something like a really big wheel on it, and then sitting way up here, and if you fall off, God help you. These are, look like they're much safer. They don't seem to have any fenders. They certainly don't have any gear shifting. I think the brakes are probably on the rear wheel, and they're just like, some of you know this, they're just like when you push the pedal backwards, the brakes go on. Boy, do I remember that. If you don't think doesn't remember. Do I?
You use your toe first up on the front.
Oh, you use your toe. Okay, well, you want to know what happened to take that with fire. Well, I got to tell you, when I got my first bicycle, and I wanted to get a paper route, and I wanted to earn some money. And so I told my parents that. Well, they went to a yard sale, and they found a bike for $5, and they bought it for me, and they brought it home, and they wanted me to be overjoyed, and I wasn't because it was a girl's bike. Now, looking back, I shouldn't have been silly like that. But I gotta tell you, I decided right then I'll use it on my paper route. I will save every penny I make and I'll buy a boy's bike. And I did. 3 months later, I shelled out $40 for a Schwinn red and white bicycle, and it was delivered to my house, and it made me very happy. And one year I figured out how many miles I rode that thing, and it was about 10,000 miles. And I never came close to disaster except once. In the Chicago area, it does snow, we get some ice, and I'm riding along. The bicycle went out from under me, the papers went out, and this car came by trying to stop, put the brakes on, and push my bicycle along until he could stop. Fortunately, I jumped out of the way. He got out of the car and he said, "What are you doing out today?" I said, "It's my job, I gotta do this." Well, I survived, but 10,000 miles on a bike. The Wright brothers, for some reason, about 10 years before they flew, they began to manufacture bikes, sell bikes, do repairs, do painting, all of that. And this is their sister Catherine, by the way. Well, you may wonder what's significant about this. This is part of their home, and this desk is where, in 1899, Wilbur Wright sat down and wrote a letter to the Smithsonian Institution and said, "Give me any information you can on flying." Now, back in those days, if you wrote a letter like that, a lot of people would think you're a kook. You're a wacko. You want to do what? And some people would say, God doesn't want you to fly. Don't you know that? I don't know where in the Bible they got that, but there are people that said that. 1899. Had he not done that, none of this story would have happened. But that's where he sat. He wrote the letter, and I guess he got something back from the Smithsonian. The second thing is, where is a good place to fly? And the Wright brothers were thinking about birds, and they thought when the bird soars, it's probably picking up a little wind current. When people fly kites, they're picking up wind current. And so the Wright brothers thought the best thing must be to go someplace where there is wind most of the time. That's one thing. The second thing, they did realistically think, you're gliding along, and first they knew they had to go to a glider. You're gliding along, and something goes wrong, and pretty soon you're down, and some of their landings were like at 30 or 35 miles per hour. So they said maybe it would be a good idea to have some soft sand. So where can we get soft sand, wind, and maybe not too many people around to be nosy? Where can we do that? So they wrote to the Weather Bureau, and they got an answer back. And the answer was the Outer Banks of North Carolina, right there. Yeah, Kitty Hawk, the most well-known because of what they did. Has anybody here been to the Outer Banks?
Yes,
Ooh.
I went to the museum.
Did you go to the museum?
Yes, sir.
You did?
Yes.
Oh, that's good. We went there at the wrong time. We went there in 2002, and they were rebuilding it. And the reason was because the next year, of course, was the centennial of flight. And so we didn't get to go to the museum. But there are markers. On December 17th, 2003, there were 4 flights made by the Wright brothers. And they have markers where they started, where the flight went, and so forth.
You can walk up the hill where they started.
Yeah, it's well worthwhile. I hope to get there before I gave this talk and take a lot of pictures, but a few things going wrong and some trips to the hospital and things like that, it didn't help. Anyway, The Outer Banks now have some bridges connecting to the mainland over here. They did not exist back in 1903 or 1900. We started this story in 1900. But Wilbur Wright, the boss man sort of, Wilbur Wright said in 1900, I'm going to go check this out. And so he got on the train. He went from Dayton, Ohio. You know Dayton is in the extreme southwestern part of Ohio. He took the train to a place called Elizabeth City. And then, how do you get over here? No bridges back then. And so he had to find a guy with a boat. And can you take me to Kitty Hawk? And a lot of guys say, what? Take you where? Where's that? But he finally found somebody who knew. And they took him and a few of his parts and tools and so forth over here. And he began to settle in to see what he could do. Here's the post office. This is the postmaster. His name is Bill Tate and his family. And they became really good friends of the Wright brothers. And one of the things I'm thinking, how did these guys, these high school, not even high school, maybe dropouts, their education stopped maybe even before high school, how did they accomplish so much? And one of the reasons, I think, was that they had help. All right. Now, this looks like kind of a godforsaken place, doesn't it? But there's a soft stand, not too many trees to run into. And this is a building that houses people like this who are called lifesavers. Lifesavers. Yeah, if you're out and get in trouble in the ocean, they will get in a boat and row out as quickly as they can and try to pick you up. And if they don't succeed, then you don't succeed either. But if they do, they save your life. And so back then, I guess the government had these lifesaver stations set up every 6 miles. And so we happen to have one here. This is a kind of a house that houses both the weather bureau for these guys and also is a telegraph. So you can telegraph things. And I don't know what they use this for, but yeah, and most of the time, wind is blowing. Wind is blowing. And for the Wright brothers, that was a key, essential. Look at these guys. If you don't have a mustache, you have not been paying attention. What? They look tough, don't they? And they were tough. And I think the Wright brothers utilized these guys, utilized their muscles to do their work. And you're going to see that, I think, as we go along. Here's the lifesavers at work. But, you're not saving people every day. Even Billy Graham doesn't do that. Yeah, not every day. But here they are trying to get out there and save somebody's life. But they've got time. And I think this for the Wright brothers. I wonder if they knew that when they went there, that there would be these guys there. If you make friends with them, they've got maybe some leisure time that they can help you, and so they do. Well, if you're looking for a nice place to live for a while, this is not it. Here's a picture taken by the Wright brothers, and somebody wrote in their camp, and you can see there's the camp, a couple of buildings, and some of these buildings were built quickly, and probably not quite the way Woodford's would do it. And they might leave the building and go home for the winter and come back the next spring and find that the wind had picked it up and took it down the road about 20 feet or so. This was common, but look at all the water. Sometimes they get a flood here. They started out with a tent, and boy, that wasn't a good idea, so they eventually did more than that. Now, I got to say something else about these brothers. I think you got to say they were careful, they were compulsive, they worried about neatness, and that was a good thing. They had to rebuild that glider of theirs over and over and over again and pay attention to every detail. But let me ask you this. How does your kitchen look? This is a kitchen that they built into one of their buildings everything, every can, every cup. Does your kitchen look like that? Here they are, out in this wilderness, and look what the kitchen looks like. This is the guy in charge of the Lifesavers. His name is Captain Hobbs, and apparently Wilbur and Orville did become very good friends with him because that day, December 17th, when they flew 4 times, one of the first people they wanted to tell was Captain Hobbs. It also looks like the guy was putting a roof on, or somebody was. They've got these supports up there on the roof where they could put something, to do that with. And in the upper part of that building, they put a couple of beds, one for Orville, one for Wilbur. But when they had guests, I don't know how they did it, they must have piled in more than one person in these beds. And apparently nobody fell out and broke a neck or anything, so that's good. Here is Wilbur doing something in the shop. That shop is pretty hard to get around in. It's got a lot of stuff. Here's last year's glider or next year's glider. I don't know which it is. It's really full. But think about this. These guys had such, I think, a hard life. In the season for selling bicycles is not surprisingly is about April. And if they're going to sell about 150, they're going to have to make 150 before then. And so they got to get back here from the Outer Banks to get to the bicycle shop and make bicycles. And then in April, they sell them. They have maybe 15 to 20 repair jobs a week. They work on those. They need the money. They are not independently wealthy. They need the money. Chanute said to them one day, now think about this, because I think Chanute was right. He said, what would happen if somebody gave you guys $10,000? Wouldn't that be a tremendous help to your work? They wouldn't take it. They wouldn't even think about it. They wouldn't even talk about it. Chanute said, I know Carnegie. I know Carnegie, the steel guy, the guy that put libraries all over the place. I know him. And I think I can get them to easily give you $10,000. And they said no. And so this bicycle work is their income. They really needed every dollar. And yet to go from Dayton, Ohio, you could look it up on a map, to go from there to the Outer Banks was a long way. To pack up a glider that they're building safely so to get there, hard to do. And yet, let me tell you this. We talked about this guy who's spending $70,000 on a glider. They spent $1,000. And they won. They did it. They did it. Amazing. Well, here's the camera they bought for $55, taking picture after picture. And then they said, the first thing you do with a new glider is check it out. And so here you see them, and you're thinking, what? You're supposed to fly in this. You're not supposed to fly like a kite. But the first thing that they would do, it's a 1901 glider, would be to take that wind that's coming in and fly this thing like a kite. And while they're doing that, they can tie up some ropes and things so that they can pull on this and pull on that. And so what they can do is to check the controls. Well, looks crazy, right? Wilbur and Orville flying their 1901 glider as a kite. That's how they began the testing project. Looks crazy. Oh, you may be wondering, how do you launch a glider? How much work is this? This is an actual picture that came from the Wright brothers, I think. And what they're saying is, if you look right there, if you've got excellent eyes, or you're maybe just a liar, you can see something there. Okay, you can? And if we enlarge that, and this is what happened here, enlarge that. This picture, I think, got caught in the flood. There was a flood in Dayton, and they lost some of the pictures, but this got chewed up pretty badly. But there is the glider here, and there's a couple of guys on either side of it, and I think you can guess what they're doing. Because what they're doing is, there's a guy on either side, they're on top of the hill, see how high that hill is, and what they're essentially doing is holding on to these struts of this thing and throwing them off the hill. And if they're lucky, they're going to go down a little bit, but they're on a pretty high hill to begin with, but they're going to build up the speed, they're going to get the lift they need, and they're going to come in, and the last thing they're going to want to do is make a safe landing here on the soft sand. I think the next picture shows that. Oh, not quite there yet. This picture shows what often happened. It shows Orville clinging to the upset glider, and there he is, saying, "It's not working, guys. It's not working." And here we are. But don't forget, Lilienthal paid the ultimate price. They somehow could do this over and over and over again, and were never seriously hurt. And something else, this picture shows Wilbur sewing. Now, if you girls, you women want somebody who's going to sew a lot to help you sew in your house, get a guy who makes gliders, and maybe you'll be lucky like, well, they never got married. But when they had real serious damage on the glider, what they would do is cut off, it's usually a kind of white muslin, is to cut that muslin off and give it to the people around the area. And they would make clothes out of it. These people living like in Kitty Hawk were living, it must have been abject poverty. You know, if you're not part of a lifesaver, what's your job? What do you do? Where you get money? And they would love to get the fabric off the airplane to make clothes out of it and so forth. And it kind of struck me. Notice something else. How do you dress when you're learning how to fly? Yeah? I'm sure Dick did this all the time anyhow, but necktie. I don't think I've seen a single one of these pictures where the guys were not wearing neckties. Yeah. Yeah, you didn't bring yours. I don't know. There's a couple things I can't figure out. One of them is why they're wearing neckties all the time. And the second thing is these guys on the glider, what's holding them in there? Why don't they fall out? Well, let's look at some more pictures and try to figure it out. Oh, first this. Here we got a couple of guys, not even high school graduates, never college, never courses in engineering, never a lot of mathematics. And what they found out as early as 1901, that the calculations they were using that came from people like Lilienthal, Langley, and Chanute were wrong. Now, I gotta suspect from a lot of us guys, if we got in that pinch, we'd say, the heck with it, I'm not gonna do this. If these brains can't figure it out, how can we? They didn't do that. They said, let's find the answer. Let's find the answer. What kind of curves do we need in the wing? What kind of controls do we need? The things they call rudders on the airplane. What do we need here? What to do? And so they tested 38 wing surfaces. And you're probably thinking, they did? How do you do that? You build 38 gliders? No, I can't do that. They took hacksaw blades, and they bent them, and they cut them, and they twisted them, and then they saw, how does the air go over the hacksaw blade? And which of these designs, which of these curvatures is going to give me the best flight, the most lift? Well, that may sound like something it's maybe not too hard to do, but think about this. Most air is invisible. Oh, how do you see air?
You can bonfire.
You're getting close. Smoke a cigar. Now, the Wright brothers never smoked until they got into this. They never smoked, they never drank, they never dated. They just worked. And so they built a wind tunnel. Now, still got a few problems. You would think, oh, a wind tunnel, we can plug it in somewhere, right? No. No electricity. No electricity. Can't do that. So they used a gasoline engine to run the wind tunnel. My hope is they were smart enough to put the gasoline engine outside the building. Well, I don't know that for sure. I do know that every time they tested this thing, one of the brothers would agree to smoke a cigar. And so and the other guy's watching the smoke go by and seeing what kind of shape do we need. And they tested 38 different wind surfaces until they felt they had the best one. Well, we're almost there. Any questions so far as you look at this? You're going to love these guys? Look at that. Suppose you were piloting this glider. What is holding that guy in? I've looked at those pictures. I cannot see any safety precautions, any belts, anything that would help to hold him in. And here he is. He's landed at about 30 miles per hour. Still got his hat on his head. He didn't even lose his hat. But look how close those skids are to the sand. When I first saw pictures like that so many years ago, I thought, what's wrong with these Wright brothers? Won't they know not to put wheels on this thing? But they liked the skids, and they felt the skids were safer on the sand. And when they had 1,000 or 2,000 flights that ended up like this, I think they must have been right. I think they must have been right. But look at this. Now, this is, let's go here. Well, we actually looked at that already. Let's go up to 1903. They're ready. They've got an engine, a motor made. They're ready to fly a motorized plane, but they can't stop gliding. They had a glider that they thought had the tremendous ability, and they were right. And here it is. But look, one of these guys flying on the wing. Now, notice this thing back here. I think they called it a rudder. And you can see what that would do. Turn it a little bit, the air hits it, and the plane goes a little bit left. Put it the other way, the plane goes right. And so it's like sort of like a steering wheel. And so their planes, they look very similar. They just kind of move things around. So this is one of the things. And if you look, I want to thank Walt Christoffel for this. This is what the Wright Flyer looked like. And there's that vertical rudder back here. And here in the front, in those pictures, the front, you can go up, if you want the plane to go up or down, you move the front rudder. We would probably call it an elevator these days. And if you go a little further to other airplanes, they would put those things not in the front, but in the back, in the tail. And so that's what we have here. Well, this new glider was very good. And one of them, I don't know which one, set a record in the sense that he was up in that glider for 9 minutes. 9 minutes in a glider. And that record stayed for about 10 years before somebody broke it. But, would you want to do that? He did it over again. Well, in 1903, Chanute came by, and he wanted to observe what's going on and get caught up with the news, and he brought with him a guy named Herring, Augustus Herring. And look at this guy. So I magnified that, to get a better look at Herring, and here he is, and I got to tell you, I don't know what's holding him in, unless it's just his grasp. Maybe there's something I don't see there. But, well, this picture is kind of famous because they're claiming when Herring was trying out this glider for Chanute, this is as far as it got off the ground, and pretty soon Herring is back on the ground with his feet going, I guess. So Herring did not succeed. And the reason I mention this is because in later years, a number of people are going to claim the Wright brothers stole all my ideas and they flew. I should get the credit for inventing the airplane, not them. Herring is one of those people. And I think that's as close as he got to flying. Well, what about the motor? I kind of wondered this. 1903, there aren't many cars around. There aren't many motors being made anywhere. In fact, the Wright brothers began to contact motor makers all over the country, and only one of them responded that he had a motor that might work in the plane, but it weighed too much, and they thought it just wouldn't work. This guy here, Charlie Taylor, was hired by the Wright brothers. Now, Catherine couldn't stand this guy because he was kind of a know-it-all, she said. He's always telling me how brilliant he is. He's always telling me, what he can do. I just can't stand this guy. What Wilbur and Orville, I think, could see, yeah, maybe he talks too much, but this guy can make anything. He's very talented with tools. He's a very good mechanic. And so they said to him, make a motor that weighs less than 200 pounds, and this is his motor. Now, I don't know what you're seeing in this. I don't know what's where and what and so forth. This doesn't look like a motor. But here it is. These two guys are going to put their life on the line to fly the first airplane, and the motor makes 8 horsepower. Probably less than your lawnmower. 8 horsepower. It has no spark plugs. There's something that makes and breaks inside the engine that creates a spark, I guess, and makes it and works. There's no carburetor. The gasoline goes into kind of like a bowl, and it vaporizes, and this make and break thing somehow ignites it. If you're thinking that maybe not going to work very well, I'm thinking that too. But it worked. That motor worked. Now, it didn't work right away, but here's one of the flights here. And if you look at Walt's model carefully, now here, if you're just gliding, you have a couple of guys throw you off the cliff, and that's all right. That's low tech. But now, if you got a motor, and on the back of that are a couple of the 8.5 feet propellers. And you got an 8 horsepower motor that you hope is going to be strong enough to get you off the ground. But still, you've got to go fast enough. And they decided that maybe taking off from a hill may not be the best thing in all cases. They put this track in place. And that track is simply 2x4s, number of 2x4s put together, covered with a metal skin, and then they had something they called a truck. Must have some wheels on it that runs on that track and fits into the airplane, and so the airplane can now run along that track on wheels and hopefully get enough speed to be able to take off. Hopefully. Well, you've got to have faith. You can see the track is right there. I don't know what this is, the picture's kind of torn up here, so that's not something to take a look at. Let's come back to that one. But wait a minute. Langley's not done yet. This is like this is like a story. This is like a novel. Langley's not there yet. Not gone yet. December 8th, 1903. December 8th. So he hires, again, Charles Manley. Manley strips off his clothing down to his, I got this in the book, union suit. They used to call them union suits back then. I don't know why. Anybody know why? Made by union workers? You don't know. Anyway, he stuffs around him cork all over his body. Then he puts clothes back on again, outer clothing, so that if he does fall in the river, well, of course he knows he's going to fall in the river. There's no place else to go. He will maybe float, and they can get him out. That's why they call this guy Manley. Maybe not Wright, but Manley. Well, he takes off. The catapult works. It shoots one of these things out into the air, and then something bad happens. I think that's our next picture. This flight doesn't look too good at this point, right? What happens is the thing shoots out, the nose starts to go up, and of course he tries to put it down, but while he's going up, something happens, and fabric gets ripped off, and some of the parts of this thing get ripped off, and so he ends up, I think that's the next one, he ends up about 20 feet from the barge, from the houseboat, and somebody puts in the paper, airship fails to fly. Professor Langley's machine goes down to the river bottom. Well, yeah, that's going to happen. The ladder rescued, or Professor Manley is aboard. The ladder rescued from perilous position. Now, Manley did have a problem. He got all this stuff on top of him, and he was able, had to break free of that to get out from under and to be able to get up where he could breathe again, and they did pick him up. All right. In later years, Langley's supporters would say, oh, this is a good flight. The trouble is, the catapult didn't work. Glenn Curtis, who made his own airplanes like that one right over there, Glenn Curtis then rebuilt the thing, claimed it performed pretty well, and for years and years, a lot of people said Langley made the first flight. Of course, that wasn't true. This picture is, I think, pretty much identical to Walt's model here. And you see one of the Wright brothers here, who had been stabilizing the plane, letting it go. That 8-horsepower engine is in there. The other Wright brother lying on the wing. And this is the track we were talking about, and it worked. It worked. December 17th, 2003, and look at what happened. Here's the numbers. Flight number 1, 120 feet, 12 seconds. Well, that's going to look like, 12 seconds, 120 feet, third of a football field maybe? Well, it did it again. Flight 2, 175 feet. Maybe impressive. Flight 3, 200 feet. Flight 4, 852 feet, and he flew for 59 seconds before he landed in the soft sand. Now, if you look at your watch and time out a minute, it's going to seem like a long time. But for the Wright brothers, think of that thing. For the first time in human history, somebody is flying a machine, carrying a person with a motor on it. Just think what that can do. Well, what to do? And so the Wright brothers sent a telegram to Catherine, and they said, tell the local editor what we've done, and maybe he will print it in the Dayton paper. Well, the editor gets this telegram. We flew for 59 seconds. We flew 852 feet. And this editor says, oh, what are these kooks doing? 59 seconds? If it's 59 minutes, then come and talk to me. We'll put that in the paper. 59 seconds. Well, let me tell you the rest of the story very quickly. This is kind of interesting. So, for years, people said Langley was the guy who invented and made and flew the first airplane. By this time, well, Wilbur had died and Orville was taking over, and both of them had been incensed by this injustice. And Wilbur said, I'm not going to give, oh, by the way, the Wright brothers plane, that one, when it was after the fourth flight, they're thinking, boy, what a day this is, let's do it again. And what happened then was that wind came and caught it and rolled it around and destroyed part of it, and they had to rebuild the whole thing. But that plane never flew again. That was the end of the Wright Flyer 1. Well, the Smithsonian did agree to show it. They wouldn't admit these guys invented it, but they showed it. And the Wright brothers said, no, we won't do that. Finally, as late as 1928, Orville agreed, and the Smithsonian agreed, they came to an agreement that they would show the plane, but Orville said only under one condition, and that is this inscription must be there, always. And if you don't agree, or you take it off the wall, the plane will revert to my estate, and you're never going to see it again. And what it said, the original Wright brothers aeroplane, the world's first power-driven, heavier-than-air machine in which man made free, controlled, and sustained flight, invented and built by Wilbur and Orville Wright, flown by them at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, December 17, 1903, by original scientific research, the Wright brothers discovered the principles of human flight. As inventors, builders, flyers, they further developed the airplane and taught man how to fly. And I think a few years later, they made something they called the Baby Grand. Now it's got wheels on it. They don't have to worry about soft stand anymore. They're just trying to sell this thing, but look at the speed. A few years later, 70 miles per hour. The duration of flights, a few years later, hours, not minutes, hours. And they had done it. As a matter of fact, here is Wilbur really showing off, flying around the Statue of Liberty, attracting notice. Oh, and here is Wilbur in, I think it's in France, and he has an American woman here who is going to become the first woman to ever fly. But notice, they're not lying on the wing anymore. They're sitting down, and he's working the controls here, and people worried, if you take a woman up in the airplane, her skirt might come up, you might see things you really shouldn't see. We could never get my grandmother to fly. And she gave the reason. She said, well, why don't you want to go visit people? You can do it quickly. No. She said, if I fly, and if there's an accident and I fall out of the airplane, she said, I would come down with my skirt over my head. Never got her to fly. Well, what they did here is tie a rope around the bottom of that woman's skirt so that you can't get any free looks at that. And they're claiming that for some women that became a fashion statement and they developed a hobble skirt. I don't know.
What year was that?
Who knows these things? But finally, Catherine got a chance to fly. I think that's with Wilbur. And look at the rope around her legs. She's going up there. And there she is. This was one of the, you may know the name Selfridge. You may have heard it somewhere. And this was a military man. He went up in the plane with Orville, and I don't know exactly what happened, but there was an accident. This is what's left of the plane. Orville was badly hurt. He couldn't fly again for about a month. He was badly hurt, and Selfridge lost his life. So this became the first person to lose his life in an airplane. But look at this. Dayton, Ohio, June 17th to 18th, 1909. They are having a commemoration, a Wright Day parade, recognition of the Wright brothers in Dayton, Ohio. And pretty soon, by 1911, this plane is a plane that actually flew across the English Channel, and it was flown by a man named Blériot. There is a copy of this, by the way, in Chicago, in the Museum of Science and Industry. You can see this hanging from the ceiling. So, crossing the English Channel. No room for mistakes, no room for errors and problems here. And something else that I didn't realize, the Wright brothers, between 1909 and 1915, had a manufacturing plant. And here they are building this. When they formed the company in 1909, Wilbur, the bossy guy, Wilbur became the president. Orville became one of the two vice presidents, and they began selling their airplanes. In 1912, Wilbur became ill, and he had typhoid, and he died. That was the end. And I think Orville just did not want to run a factory, and so in 1915 they sold it. But don't feel too bad for Orville because, that's the house he bought. Not too shabby, not too shabby.
Got it on the $5,000.
There you have it. Any questions? Yeah.
What came down there with a burning question is, how did they move all their stuff from, like you said, from Dayton? How did they move it to Kitty Hawk every year?
Every year.
I mean, did they have trains? Did they take a train?
There was a couple of things, I think, and one of them is, yes, they were able to pack so carefully because this stuff is really valuable.
Yeah.
And they must have made an agreement with the railroad to, maybe reserve a car or something like that. The other thing is, they couldn't, of course, put it all together because if you look at Walt's collection here, which he tells me are the same scale, this fighter plane compared to the Wright Flyer, the Wright Flyer is really quite large. And you can't pack that onto a train car, so they had to do some manufacturing after they got to Kitty Hawk under bad conditions.
How would they even know, to get some machinery out there to build a factory to make the plane?
Yeah.
They made it in Ohio.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. And there's a lot of questions. Another question I have, maybe somebody knows. When they build a building, they would do that inside of a week or 10 days. Where'd they get the wood?
Yeah.
You don't see trees on any of the pictures I've shown.
Yeah.
Think so?
was like
Oh.
secrets.
book.
Oh, okay. Hey. He's read the book here. Okay.
You didn't.
I'm embarrassed here. Yeah, I do recommend the book, by the way. What else? Yeah, this is in Dayton. Is it still there? Have you seen it?
Yes.
Okay. He lived there between 1914 and 1948, so he was there a long time.
They made friends with a guy in Ohio. His name was Rube. If anybody here ever heard of him, he was a bee, made all his money in bees. He wrote to the Wright brothers, and he went and met their father. He got in with them and helped them a lot. He published a beekeeper's paper.
Yes, that's in the book.
In 1899 or something, they had the thing of his first flight.
Yeah.
I mean, he was kind of backing them, but he didn't want to give away a lot of secrets. And he always cleared stuff with the Wright brothers. But when they went down to Kitty Hawk, the locals really liked them.
And, you know, you can see why you need muscle power to do what they had to do at Kitty
Well,
Hawk.
when did they fly in Caltex during Dayton? Did they-
After '03, after a few years after
Yeah.
Kitty Hawk, they stayed right in Ohio, and the local newspaper guy didn't go watch them.
Yeah,
It was Root and there's other people, and then finally they started going out to see them.
in fact, they did. They were, after 1903, they thought, yeah, we got to deal with people around and what you're saying. It's so hard to move all this stuff every time we make the trip. Why don't we do this in a place called Huffman Prairie? And that's nearby, so we can do it there. They got permission from the guy who owned it. His name was Huffman. And they had a few things to deal with because there was a commuter train that would go by on the outside of the property, and people could look over there and see things happening. So the Wright brothers memorized the timetable, and they would do things in between when the train would go by, so that was some help to them. The other thing was that there's much less wind in Huffman Prairie, and it's much flatter. So how do you get the plane away quickly enough? And this is what they did. They made this derrick here, and that's a weight. Now, sometimes they put a lot of weight, like I think in one case, they tried 1,600 pounds of something, probably metal. And here's the plane on a track, and this is the cable. So when they let this weight drop, it pulls this cable and shoots the plane out into the air. So yeah, they were able to do this at Huffman Prairie.
How's that day? We went to,
Have you ever been to the Glenn Curtis Museum in
What's that?
Amherstport? Have you ever been to the Glenn Curtis Museum in
Yes.
Amherstport? There, you can sense that terrific rivalry between Curtis and Wright brothers.
Curtis did a lot of things, that's for sure. And, at the beginning of World War II, the Curtis P-40 was one of the best planes that we had. And he did invent things, and he liked aquatic airplanes, and nobody else just wanted to do that. Yeah, Curtis Museum is worth going to see.
and for a long time, though, there was a big feud and they lost between Curtis and Wright.
Yeah, because I think that's an interesting point, because I think at some point, the guys got over this kind of excitement about something new, and are thinking, well, gee, we spent all this time, we spent all this effort, shouldn't we get money out of it? And I think what they began to think is that maybe, wouldn't it be nice, every time somebody took off and landed an airplane, they got to send us some money. And wouldn't that be a nice deal? And so they had solved so many of these problems. For example, if your plane is going along and it starts to tilt to one side, you need to be able to get it up again and straight. And what happened is they would do something called wing warping. And they would hook a wire up to the end of the wing, and then you could, maybe this might go down, this goes up, and that would be a way of correcting the tilt in your airplane. Well, somebody else, maybe Curtis, I'm not sure, but somebody else said, well, wing warping, why don't we just put a little vane on there, we'll call it an aileron, and that will do the same thing. So the Wright brothers would sue. Is it really different? Is it the same? Have they infringed the patents? I don't know. That became they spent. People think one of the reasons maybe that Wilbur may have weakened and died is because he just couldn't take any more of this legal maneuvering. Okay?
Thank you.
Dan, come and take a look at things here. Terrific.